My son handed me a glass of water at the Christmas dinner table. An hour later, I was standing in his kitchen, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. What I found wasn't just a family secret. It was a $2 million murder plot. And I was the target. Before I tell you how this perfect holiday dinner turned into a crime scene, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel because you won't believe the trap I set for them in the end. The lie began at the dinner table. It always does. The centerpiece was a mountain of pine boughs and glittering ornaments so tall you could barely see the person across from you. In this case, that person was my son David. The table was laden with a feast that could have fed a small army, a perfectly brown turkey glistening under the light of a crystal chandelier. Everything was perfect, too perfect. My daughter-in-law Chloe raised her glass of wine. The diamond on her finger caught the light and shattered it into a dozen tiny rainbows. "A toast," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "To family, to success, and to a wonderful Christmas." David smiled, a wide practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "To success," he echoed, looking at me. "It's been a great year for the firm. We just landed the Henderson account." I nodded, taking a small sip of water. Henderson account. It sounded impressive, but I had spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, a bloodhound for numbers that didn't add up. My entire life was about finding the lie hidden in the ledger. And my son's life was a ledger full of red ink. I knew for a fact that his firm was just him and a laptop in a rented office space. 6 months ago, he had come to me, his face a mask of shame, asking for a $50,000 loan. A short-term bridge, he'd called it an investment opportunity he couldn't pass up. I gave it to him, of course. You always do. You tell yourself it's the last time, that this will be the one that turns it all around. But as I sat there listening to them talk about their upcoming ski trip to Aspen and the new Lexus in the driveway, I did the math in my head. The $50,000 was gone. I knew that. But this display, this was something else. The watch on David's wrist was easily $10,000. Chloe's dress was from a designer whose name I only knew because my late wife used to dream of owning one. Their performance of wealth was costing a fortune. That's when I felt it. A dull ache in my chest, a gentle squeeze around my heart. I put my fork down. A wave of dizziness washed over me, making the chandelier lights blur into a single blinding star. I took another sip of water, hoping to clear my head. Stress, I told myself. The holidays are always stressful. The rich food, the emotional strain of seeing my son live a life built on a foundation of sand. It's just indigestion, but the pressure in my chest grew tighter. It felt like a band slowly being constricted. "Dad, are you okay?" David asked. The concern in his voice sounded almost genuine. "I'm fine," I managed to say, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." "Chloe, the meal is spectacular." "Truly," she beamed. "Oh, it's nothing, Jacob. We're just so happy you could be here." The room felt warm, too warm. The scent of pine and roasting meat was suddenly suffocating. I needed to get up to move. "If you'll excuse me," I said, placing my napkin on the table. "I think I just need a glass of fresh water." I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. As I walked towards the kitchen, I could feel their eyes on my back. The walk down the short hallway felt like a mile. The polished hardwood floors seemed to sway beneath my feet. I gripped the door frame of the kitchen to steady myself. The room was a marvel of modern design, all stainless steel and gleaming white countertops. It looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. But just like their lives, the perfection was only on the surface. A pile of mail was shoved carelessly into a corner of the counter, a messy stack of envelopes threatening to spill onto the floor. I reached for a glass from the cabinet, and my sleeve brushed against the pile. It was all the force needed to upset the fragile balance. Letters and bills cascaded across the granite, scattering like fallen leaves. "Damn it!" I muttered, bending down to pick them up. Bills from high-end department stores, a letter from a luxury car dealership, and then one envelope that made me freeze. It was from the Prudential Insurance Company. My name and address were clearly visible through the plastic window. I hadn't done business with them in over a decade. My heart, which was already beating uncomfortably, began to hammer against my ribs. I picked up the envelope. It had been opened. My training, my instincts, every alarm bell honed over a lifetime of uncovering deceit screamed at me. This wasn't my mail. It had been sent to my address, but David must have picked it up. Why, I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was a violation of privacy. But a deeper instinct, the instinct of a father who senses a profound danger, took over. My fingers, trembling slightly, pulled out the document inside. It wasn't a letter. It was a policy confirmation. The words swam before my eyes, stark and brutal in the cold kitchen light. Type of policy term, life insurance, insured, Jacob Peterson. Policy value $2 million. Policy start date 3 weeks ago. And then the final devastating line. Beneficiary David Peterson. Son. The air left my lungs. The pressure in my chest intensified into a sharp stabbing pain. $2 million. He had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on me. I sank against the counter, the smooth, cold stone doing nothing to cool the fire of betrayal that coursed through me. My mind raced trying to make sense of the impossible, the loan, the lies about his success, the extravagant spending. It was all a desperate charade. He wasn't just in debt, he was drowning in it. The wave of dizziness returned stronger this time, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I felt sick, truly sick. My eyes scanned the countertop, searching for something, anything to ground me. And then I saw it. Next to the sink was the half-empty bottle of Fiji water I had been drinking from when I first arrived. David had handed it to me himself. "Here you go, Dad. Hydrate," he'd said with a smile. And right beside it, partially hidden behind a marble salt cellar, was a small clear vial. It was no bigger than my thumb with no label. It was almost empty, but I could see a single viscous drop of clear liquid clinging to the bottom. In one horrifying crystalline moment, everything connected. The sudden illness, the tightness in my chest, the $2 million insurance policy, the unlabeled vial, the glass of water from my son's hand. This wasn't indigestion. This wasn't stress. This was an audit of my own murder. For a moment, pure, unadulterated panic seized me. I wanted to scream, to run out of the kitchen and confront them, to smash the facade of their perfect Christmas to pieces. But then a lifetime of discipline took over. I had faced down embezzlers who had stolen millions, con artists who had ruined entire companies. I had learned one crucial lesson. Never let them see you sweat. The moment you show emotion, you lose. My breathing steadied. The panic receded, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. My mind, the mind of a forensic accountant, began to work. This was no longer a family crisis. It was a crime scene, and I was the primary witness. My movements became deliberate, precise. I glanced up and saw the small dark lens of a security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. They were watching, or at least they could be. I had to act normally. I slid the insurance policy back into its envelope and placed it on the counter. Then, my hand moving with a surgeon's steadiness, I picked up the tiny vial. My fingers closed around it, and I slipped it deep into the pocket of my trousers. Evidence. I turned to the refrigerator, opened the door, and took out a new sealed bottle of water. I twisted the cap, the plastic crackling in the silent kitchen. I raised the bottle to my lips and took a long drink, letting the cool liquid soothe my raw throat. I needed to flush my system. I needed to think. After a moment, I composed myself. I smoothed my shirt, ran a hand through my hair, and pasted a neutral expression on my face. I was ready. I walked out of the kitchen and back towards the warm golden light of the dining room. Back to the lies. As I sat down, Chloe looked at me with her perfect plastic smile. Feeling better, Jacob? I looked across the table, past the ridiculous centerpiece, and met my son's eyes. He was watching me, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. I forced my own smile, a grim thin line. Much better. Thank you, I said, my voice even and calm. The water helped. He nodded satisfied and turned back to his meal. But I kept watching him, this stranger who wore my son's face. He had no idea that the game had changed. He thought he was the hunter closing in on his prey. He didn't know that I had found the trap he had set for me. And I was no longer the prey. I was the man who was going to burn his entire world to the ground. The quiet of my resolve was the most dangerous thing in that room. It was my own declaration of war. The drive home was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like an accusation. Every shadow on the side of the road felt like a threat. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white the small glass vial, a cold, hard lump in my pocket. It was a tangible piece of the nightmare, a tiny object that held the immeasurable weight of my son's betrayal. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was my sanctuary, a space where I could finally let the pieces of the evening settle, not into a coherent picture, but into the jagged shards of a shattered reality. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, I didn't rush inside. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. My house, the one where I had raised David, where my wife and I had shared 30 years of memories, looked back at me. It was a fortress of a life I thought I had built. But the enemy had not been outside the gates. He had been inside at my own table, sharing my bread. Once inside, I locked the door and drew the deadbolt. The simple metallic slide of the lock felt like the first sane action I had taken in hours. I walked through the dark, quiet rooms, my hand trailing along the walls. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see the photographs on the mantel, the ghosts of a happy family that had never really existed. In the kitchen, I placed the vial on the counter under a bright task light, examining it like a piece of alien technology. My first instinct, the raw human instinct, was to pick up the phone and dial 911, to scream into the receiver that my son, my only child, had tried to murder me for money. But then the accountant in me, the man who had built a career on cold, hard facts, took over. An accusation without irrefutable proof was just noise. It was my word against his, the word of an old man, perhaps a confused old man, against his successful, charming son. I needed more than a story. I needed a case. There was only one person I trusted to help me build it. I pulled out my phone, my fingers scrolling past David's name, without a flicker of emotion, and found the number for Michael Vance, my lawyer for 30 years and my friend for 40. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Jacob, it's almost midnight. Is everything all right?" "No, Michael. Nothing is all right," I said, my own voice sounding distant, detached. I explained everything, starting with the dinner and ending with the vial sitting on my counter. I spoke in a monotone, laying out the facts as if I were presenting a financial audit, the $2 million policy, the sudden chest pains, the bottle of water, the vial. I left out the emotion, the soul-crushing agony of it all. I just gave him the data. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of his wife asking if everything was okay. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice now wide awake and sharp. "Jacob, listen to me very carefully. Do not touch that vial again. Do not wash your hands. Put it in a sealed plastic bag. First thing in the morning, 8 a.m. sharp. I want you at the emergency room at St. Joseph's. Tell them you have chest pains and dizziness and you're worried you might have ingested something. You have a heart condition, so they will take you seriously. You need a full blood panel done. Insist on a toxicology screen. I'll make a call to a friend in the administration to make sure it's handled properly. Don't call the police. Not yet. Let's get our own evidence first. Let's build a fortress they can't breach. His words were a lifeline, a plan, a series of logical steps in a world that had ceased to make sense. "'Kay, Michael, I'll do it." "And Jacob," he said, his voice softening. "I am so sorry." I hung up the phone and did as he said, placing the vial in a Ziploc bag with a pair of tweezers. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my armchair, watching the hours tick by on the grandfather clock in the hall, each chime marking another moment I had survived. The next morning, I walked into the emergency room of St. Joseph's Hospital. The bright fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic were a harsh contrast to the festive decorations of the night before. I followed Michael's script perfectly. I described my symptoms, mentioned my existing heart condition, and expressed a vague concern that I might have accidentally taken the wrong medication. They moved me into a bay and hooked me up to monitors. A young doctor came in, his face etched with concern. He listened patiently, then ordered the tests. Blood was drawn. Questions were asked. I felt like an observer in my own life, a character in a play whose lines had been written for him. I answered everything truthfully, but I kept the core of the story, the betrayal, locked away. Hours later, the doctor returned a chart in his hand and a perplexed look on his face. "Mr. Peterson, this is unusual," he began. "Your EKG is a bit irregular, but what's more concerning is your blood work. We found traces of a drug called amiodarone in your system. It's a powerful antiarrhythmic drug. Is that something you've been prescribed?" "No, doctor," I said, my voice steady. "The only thing I take is a low-dose beta blocker." He frowned, looking at the report. "This is a clinical dosage, a significant amount. For a patient with your specific heart condition who isn't being monitored for it, a dose like this could be extremely dangerous. It could easily induce a cardiac event that would look for all intents and purposes like a natural heart attack." There it was. The mechanism, the how. A heart attack that would look natural. It was the perfect crime tailored to my specific medical history. My son had done his research. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the hospital air conditioning. I had the toxicology report printed out, a crisp official document that translated betrayal into scientific terms. I left the hospital with the report folded in my coat pocket next to the small plastic bag containing the vial. I now had the motive in the form of a $2 million insurance policy. I had the means, the vial of amiodarone, and I had the proof, a hospital report confirming the presence of that exact drug in my bloodstream. The fortress Michael had spoken of was built. The foundations were solid. When I got home, I laid all 3 pieces of evidence on my kitchen table. The insurance policy, the bagged vial, and the toxicology report. It was a holy trinity of malice. My son's greed, his cruelty, his utter disregard for my life, all laid bare in black and white. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for a father's desperate hope that he was somehow mistaken. There was only the cold, hard truth. I picked up the phone, but I didn't dial 911 in a panic. My rage had cooled into something far more dangerous: precision. When the operator answered, my voice was calm, measured, and clear. "I'd like to report a crime," I said. "I'm reporting a case of life insurance fraud." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, can you explain what you mean?" "Yes," I said, looking at the evidence on my table. "My son recently took out a $2 million life insurance policy on me without my consent. and I have reason to believe, along with medical evidence to support it, that he has made a direct attempt on my life to accelerate the claim. I gave her my name, my address, and my son's name. I spoke with the authority of a man who had all the receipts. I wasn't a grieving father. I wasn't a hysterical victim. I was a forensic accountant presenting a case file that was already closed. 2 days after my call, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a man who looked like he had been carved from oak and left out in the rain. He was in his late 50s with a tired face, a rumpled suit, and eyes that had seen too many of the world's sad stories. He held up a badge. "Detective Miller," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I'm here about the report you filed." I led him into the living room. He moved with a heavy weariness, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the family photos, the worn armchair, the quiet order of my life. I could read the thought in his mind as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. Another domestic dispute. An old man, a family fight over money, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He had already filed my story away in a mental cabinet labeled routine. My job was to prove him wrong. Instead of offering him coffee, I gestured to the dining room table. "I thought it would be best if I laid everything out for you," I said. He followed me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. On the polished wood surface, I had arranged the 3 exhibits of my case. The insurance policy was on the left, its pages filled with cold, contractual language. The toxicology report from the hospital was in the center, a stark medical confirmation of the poison in my veins. And on the right, the small glass vial still sealed in its evidence bag. Miller stopped at the table. He looked at the display, then at me. The weariness in his expression was replaced by a sharp, focused attention. He had expected a rambling, emotional story. I had given him a case file. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his tone shifting from routine to respectful. "Walk me through this." I did. For the next hour, I recounted the events of Christmas dinner. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I presented the facts with the same dispassionate clarity I would have used to explain a fraudulent expense report to a corporate board. I pointed to the policy motive. I said I pointed to the vile means. I pointed to the hospital report method. I explained my background as a forensic accountant. I told him that my entire career was based on recognizing patterns of deception, and the patterns here were unmistakable. David's performative wealth, the carefully constructed lies, the desperation I had sensed for months. This wasn't a sudden act. It was the logical endpoint of a long road of financial recklessness. Miller listened without interruption. He picked up the bagged vial, examining it in the light. He read every word of the toxicology report, his lips a thin, tight line. When I was finished, he sat back in the chair and looked at me for a long time. "In my line of work," he said, "finally 90% of cases are about emotion. Rage, jealousy, greed. They're messy, but this," he gestured to the table, "this is clean. It's calculated. You're right, Mr. Peterson. This isn't just a family squabble. This is a business plan." That was the moment I knew he believed me. The tide had turned. I was no longer a potential victim of old age and confusion. I was a credible witness. He and his partner spent the next 2 hours carefully collecting the evidence, asking precise questions. Their professionalism, a comforting balm on the raw wound of the situation. Before he left, Miller gave me his card. "We're going to look into your son's finances," he said. "If what you suspect is true, the numbers won't lie. I'll be in touch." The call came 3 days later. Jacob Miller said, dispensing with the formality of my last name, "We're digging, and it's worse than you thought." I sat down in my armchair, the phone pressed to my ear, and listened as the detective painted a portrait of my son's secret life. The illusion of wealth was financed by a mountain of debt. Miller listed the figures with the grim cadence of an executioner. $150,000 in credit card debt across 8 different cards, a second mortgage on their house that had bled out all their equity, and the final nail in the coffin, a $60,000 loan from a private lender in Philadelphia. "This isn't a bank," Jacob Miller explained. "This is a loan shark. The interest rate is criminal, and the payment was due last week. Your son was out of options. He was cornered. The ski trip to Aspen, the Lexus, Chloe's designer dress. It was all a frantic, desperate attempt to keep up appearances while the walls were closing in. The $2 million insurance policy wasn't just an opportunity for them. It was a lifeline, the only one they had left. The motive was no longer just a theory. It was a mathematical certainty. We brought them in for questioning this morning," Miller continued. "And what did they say?" I asked, though I already knew. Miller let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Your daughter-in-law, Chloe, turned on the waterworks the second we sat her down. She said it was all a terrible misunderstanding. That they bought the policy to protect you as a safety net for your old age. She said, 'You've been forgetful lately, confused.' She suggested you might need a medical evaluation. My blood ran cold. They were trying to paint me as senile. It was a classic cruel tactic. And David, I asked, he played the part of the outraged, devoted son. He was indignant. He threatened to sue the department for harassment. He said he loved you more than anything and that he couldn't believe his own father would make such a monstrous accusation. He claimed he found that vial in the park and picked it up because he was worried a child might find it. He was good, Jacob. He was very convincing. For a moment, a sliver of doubt crept in. Could I be wrong? Was this all the paranoid fantasy of an old man? But then I remembered the cold certainty I felt in that kitchen. I remembered the years of lies that had led to this point. No, this was not a fantasy. This was their final, most audacious deception. "They are lying, detective," I said, my voice low and firm. "I know," Miller said. "Their stories are good, but they don't match up on the details. They're counting on us seeing a grieving family, but I see 2 co-conspirators. The problem is, without a confession, it's still a tough case. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt about the vial. They could argue you took the medication yourself by accident. This was the moment. This was the reason Miller had called. He had the structure of the case, but he needed more. He needed the context that only I could provide. He needed the ammunition to blow their stories apart. Detective, I began my mind sifting through a lifetime of memories of receipts kept and promises broken. Let me tell you a few things about my son's history with money. Ask him, if you would, about the $50,000 loan I gave him 6 months ago for a can't-miss tech investment. I have the bank transfer records. I was never told the name of the company, and I have never seen a dollar of it back. I could hear Miller typing on his keyboard. And while you're at it, I continued, ask Chloe about her luxury handbag business, the one she started 2 years ago. It might be interesting to look up the public bankruptcy records for that company. She left a dozen small suppliers unpaid when she folded it. Keep going, Miller said, his voice tight with interest. 10 years ago, my late wife's pearl necklace went missing from her jewelry box. David swore he knew nothing about it. 2 weeks later, I quietly visited every pawn shop in a 50 miles radius. I found it in a shop in Trenton. I have the receipt from where I bought it back. I never confronted him. My wife was ill and I didn't want to cause her more pain, but I kept the receipt. I was opening the family vault, revealing the rot and decay that had been hidden for years. Each memory was a painful admission of my own blindness, of my own unwillingness to see the truth. But now each one was also a weapon. One last thing, detective. When you asked David about his finances, did he mention the trust fund my wife left him? the one he emptied in 6 months to buy a sports car and take a trip to Monaco. He was 25 at the time. I have the statements from the bank. It established a pattern, you see, a long pattern of recklessness and deceit. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I had laid the entire history of my son's failures bare. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Miller finally spoke, his voice was different. The professional collaboration was gone, replaced by something harder, something resolute. "Thank you, Jacob," he said. "That's the ammunition I need. They think they're playing a game of chess with a confused old man. They don't realize they're playing against a grandmaster." The phone call that sealed their fate came on a Thursday afternoon. It was Detective Miller. His voice had lost its usual weary tone. It was now sharp-edged with the thrill of the hunt. "We got it, Jacob," he said. "The smoking gun." I sat down, my hand tightening on the receiver. "What did you find?" "The drug amitriptyline. It's not easy to get without a prescription, but it's not impossible." We started digging into nonlinear pharmacies, the kind that operate in a legal gray area. It took some time, but we found a transaction from a Canadian website shipped to a P.O. box about 20 m from your son's house. The purchase was made 5 weeks ago. "How did they pay for it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. They wouldn't have been foolish enough to use their own credit card. "Prepaid Visa card," Miller confirmed. "Bought with cash from a 7-Eleven. They thought they were clever, that they were leaving no trail, but they made a mistake. The P.O. box was rented under a false name, but the application was filled out online. And the IP address from that application, it traces back to a coffee shop just 2 blocks from David's office. We have him on security footage from the cafe laptop open at the exact time the application was filed. On top of that, these shipping records combined with the tracking number show the package was delivered a week before Christmas. We have enough, Jacob. We have more than enough. The net is closed. A wave of something that wasn't quite relief washed over me. It was a grim, hollow finality. The last ember of hope. The father's desperate, irrational wish that there was some other explanation was finally extinguished. There was only the cold, hard ash of the truth. "So you'll arrest them now. Warrants are being drawn up as we speak," Miller said. "We can pick them up this evening." This was it. The moment of justice, but a different thought, a different plan had been taking shape in my mind for days. It wasn't enough for them to be caught by the police. That was an external force, something that happened to them. I wanted them to understand the full scope of their actions, the totality of what they had thrown away. They needed to see the checkmate not just be swept from the board by a stranger's hand. "Detective," I said, my voice steady, "I have a request. Can you give me 24 hours? Hold off on the arrest until tomorrow afternoon." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jacob, this is a serious felony. We have what we need." "Why wait?" "Because there is one last move I need to make." I said, "It's not about your case. It's about mine. I need them to understand what they've done, not just to me, but to themselves. Please, detective." One day, I could hear him sigh, a sound of exasperation mixed with a reluctant respect. "All right, Jacob. Against my better judgment, you have until 3 p.m. tomorrow. But then it's over." As soon as I hung up with Miller, I called my lawyer. "Michael, it's time." An hour later, Michael made a call to David's attorney. His approach was a work of art, a masterpiece of misdirection. He spoke of my age, my fragile health, the terrible stress this misunderstanding was putting on my heart. He painted a picture of a lonely old father, perhaps regretting his rash accusations, horrified at the thought of his only son being involved in a police investigation. He suggested a meeting, a final attempt at reconciliation, a chance to talk things over and find a peaceful resolution away from the harsh glare of the law. As Michael predicted, they took the bait. Their lawyer called back within the hour. David and Chloe were, of course, deeply hurt by the accusations. But they were willing to meet. They loved their father and they were desperate to clear their names and mend this painful family rift. They agreed to come to Michael's office the next day at noon. They thought they were walking into a negotiation. They believed they were coming to manage a confused old man to emotionally manipulate him into retracting his story. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. The next day, I sat in the conference room at Michael's law firm. It was a room designed to communicate power and permanence. The walls were pan-lead with dark mahogany lined with shelves of leather-bound law books that smelled of dust and authority. The table was a single massive piece of polished wood, so heavy it felt like part of the building's foundation. This room was a world away from the fragile, glittering facade of my son's life. This room was about consequences. I sat at the far end of the table with Michael to my right. I said nothing. My role in this was to be a silent, unmovable presence. David and Chloe arrived precisely at noon. They were dressed for their roles. David wore a tailored suit, his expression a careful blend of concern and resolve. Chloe wore a simple, elegant dress, her face a mask of sorrowful beauty. They looked like the victims, a devoted couple forced to endure an unspeakable family tragedy. They nodded gravely at me. "Dad," David said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "Thank you for doing this. I know we can sort this out." They sat down opposite us. Their lawyer, a slick man in a suit that was too expensive, began with a speech about the importance of family and the potential for misunderstandings in times of stress. I let the words wash over me. I looked at my son and the woman he had married, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the quiet final closing of a door. When their lawyer had finished, Michael leaned forward, placing a single thick folder with a blue cover on the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "Thank you for coming." Michael began, his voice calm and even. "As you know, Jacob has been through a great deal. This situation has forced him to do a lot of thinking, not just about the present, but about the future." David and Chloe exchanged a quick, confident glance. This was it. The old man was cracking. But Michael didn't mention the police. He didn't mention the hospital or the vial or the insurance policy. His voice remained placid, almost gentle. "It all started about 6 months ago, actually. David, you may remember you came to your father to ask for a significant loan. $50,000, I believe." David shifted in his chair, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "I don't see what that has to do with anything. That was a private family matter." "Of course," Michael said smoothly. But for Jacob, it was a moment of clarity. It made him realize that he needed to think seriously about his estate, about how best to protect his legacy for the future. He became concerned about financial volatility, about ensuring his life's work would be managed responsibly. Michael opened the blue folder. It wasn't a police report. It was a trust agreement. "And so 6 months ago," Michael continued, "Jacob came to me and we completely restructured his will and his assets. Everything he owns, the house, the savings, the investment portfolio, a total estate valued at approximately $8 million, was placed into a new, irrevocable trust." The air in the room grew still. The confident smirks on David and Chloe's faces began to fade, replaced by a dawning confusion. This was not the conversation they had expected. "The Jacob Peterson Legacy Trust was established to provide for you, David. Upon your father's passing," Michael said, his eyes fixed on my son, "you are named as the sole beneficiary." A wave of relief washed over David's face. He thought he had dodged a bullet. He thought this was just my old-fashioned way of controlling things. He still didn't understand. He still didn't see the jaws of the trap closing around him. Michael let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he delivered the final devastating blow. However, he said, tapping a single paragraph on the page with his finger. Given his concerns, your father insisted on adding a very specific and very binding special clause. Michael let his words hang in the silent room, the phrase special clause echoing in the space between us. I watched my son's face. The confusion was still there, but now it was curdling into suspicion. Chloe glanced at their lawyer, a silent question in her eyes, but the man looked as bewildered as they did. They were all playing a game they didn't know the rules to. They were about to learn. Michael cleared his throat, not for effect, but with the quiet deliberation of a man about to read a death sentence. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document. The clause is under Article 4, Section B. He said, his voice a dispassionate legal drone. It reads as follows. Should the primary beneficiary, David Peterson, be convicted of any state or federal felony offense, this trust shall be immediately dissolved. He paused, letting the first part of the trap snap shut. David's lawyer blinked. A felony clause that's highly unusual but not unheard of. David let out a tense, nervous laugh. A felony? What are you talking about? I'm not a criminal. He looked at me, a desperate plea for reason in his eyes. Dad, this is insane. What is this all about? I remained silent. My gaze was steady. I was simply the accountant here to watch the final numbers being tallied. Michael held up a hand. Please let me finish. There is a second condition. He looked back down at the page. Continues. Furthermore, should the death of the grantaire Jacob Peterson be deemed by a court of law or a coroner's inquest to be of a non-natural cause directly or indirectly resulting from the actions or conspiracy of the beneficiary, then the beneficiary is immediately and irrevocably disinherited. He looked up, his eyes meeting David's. And here is the final provision. In the event that either of these conditions is met, the entire principal of the Jacob Peterson Legacy Trust, including all assets therein, shall be liquidated, and the full proceeds transferred as a single unrestricted donation to the National Center for Victims of Financial Fraud. For a full 30 seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. David and Chloe were staring at Michael, their faces blank with incomprehension, as if he had just read a passage in a foreign language. They were still trying to fit this new information into their own narrative, the one where they were in control, where they could talk their way out of this inconvenient mess. Chloe was the first to break. Her carefully constructed mask of sorrow crumpled. I don't understand, she stammered, looking from Michael to me. What does any of this mean, Jacob? Why would you do this? It was David who finally put the pieces together. His face, which had been pale with confusion, suddenly flushed with a dark, furious red. The realization hit him, not as a quiet dawn, but as a violent explosion. He slammed his hands on the table, the sound making everyone jump. This is a trick, he roared, his voice cracking with rage and panic. He's trying to intimidate us. You can't do this. It's my inheritance. It's my birthright. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He's senile. This is proof. No court in the country will uphold this. We'll fight this. Michael didn't flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of calm authority. On the contrary, David, he said, his voice soft but unyielding, the trust is irrevocable. It was signed and witnessed 6 months ago. We have a notarized affidavit from your father's physician dated the same day certifying that he was of sound mind and body and under no duress. We also have a video recording of the entire signing process. It is, I assure you, ironclad. The fight drained out of David's face, replaced by the hollow, gray look of utter defeat. He sank back into his chair. He finally understood. They both did. I watched them as the full devastating weight of my trap settled upon them. Their plan had been to commit the perfect crime, to poison me in a way that mimicked a natural heart attack, to collect a clean $2 million from the insurance company, and then to inherit the remaining $8 million upon my tragic but not unexpected death, a $10 million prize. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated me. They saw me as an old man, a resource to be managed and eventually liquidated. They never saw me as the man who had spent 40 years thinking 3 steps ahead of smarter criminals than them. The trap wasn't the police investigation. The trap wasn't the vial of poison. The true trap was this document signed and sealed 6 months ago. They had been caught in it the moment they decided to act. Their fatal flaw was their greed. They could have simply waited, but they were impatient. The insurance fraud was their undoing. Even if by some miracle they managed to beat the attempted murder charge, insurance fraud for a sum of $2 million is a serious federal felony. The moment a jury convicted them of that, the clause would be triggered. The $8 million inheritance would vanish. They hadn't been playing for a $10 million prize. They had been gambling with $8 million they were already set to inherit. All for the chance to get an extra $2 million a little bit sooner. And they had lost everything. They had spent months planning a crime, not realizing that their punishment had already been written into law, my law, waiting for them to walk right into it. Chloe began to sob, not loud theatrical sobs, but the silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of someone whose entire world has just been reduced to dust. David just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his eyes vacant. The hatred was gone. The anger was gone. There was nothing left but the vast empty space of his own ruin. He saw it all now. He saw the checkmate. At that exact moment, there was a sharp authoritative knock on the conference room door. Michael looked at me. I gave a slight nod. "Come in," Michael called out. The door opened and Detective Miller stepped inside. He was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. The air of quiet legal devastation was instantly replaced by the stark, unavoidable reality of the state. Miller's tired eyes found David and Chloe. He held up his badge, a formality that was almost absurd in its redundancy. "David Peterson," Miller said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Chloe Peterson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and for insurance fraud." The unformed officers moved forward. I heard the sharp metallic click of handcuffs being fastened around Chloe's wrists. She didn't resist. She was utterly broken. The second officer approached David, who remained seated, staring into nothing. "Sir, please stand up and put your hands behind your back." David didn't seem to hear him. He was looking at me, his eyes finally focusing. He wasn't seeing a father or a victim. He was seeing the architect of his demise. He had thought he was playing a game of chess, but he had been a pawn on my board all along. As they led him away, his hands cuffed behind his back. He was silent. The fight was over. The performance was done. The play had ended. All that was left was the quiet of the empty room, the blue folder still sitting on the table, and the final balanced entry in the ledger of my life. I felt no victory, no joy, just the profound, sorrowful piece of a long and painful calculation finally coming to zero. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 6 months after that terrible Christmas dinner, the legal proceedings came to a quiet end. The evidence was overwhelming, the digital and chemical trails leading to David and Chloe as surely as a map. A jury found them guilty on all counts. The sentences were long. There was no dramatic courtroom confession, no tearful apology. There was only the dull bureaucratic finality of a gavel falling on wood. A week later, Michael called me. His voice was calm, businesslike. "It's done, Jacob," he said. "The transfer is complete. The entire $8 million from the trust has been received by the National Center for Victims of Financial Fraud. The books were balanced. The final entry had been made. The case was closed. I thanked him and hung up the phone. I was sitting in my armchair, the one my wife always used to say I would become a permanent part of. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust moas dancing in the still air. I should have felt something. Triumph, perhaps, or the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but I felt neither. Instead, what settled over me was a profound and unexpected sense of peace. It was the quiet that comes after a long and violent storm when the wind dies down and you can finally hear the sound of your own breathing again. This was never about revenge. Revenge is a fire, a hot, consuming rage that destroys everything in its path, including the person who wields it. What I had done was the opposite of fire. It was ice. It was a cold, deliberate, and necessary calculation. It was the last audit of my life. I had examined a set of accounts that were deeply criminally unbalanced, and I had simply put things back in order. Ordnung, the German word for it. Not just order, but a state of rightness of things being in their proper place. I thought of David. I did not think of the man in the courtroom with the hollow eyes and the expensive suit. I thought of the little boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, his small hand curled around my finger. I thought of the teenager I taught how to drive his knuckles white with fear and excitement on the steering wheel of my old Ford. Where did that boy go? When did the rot set in? And in the quiet of my home, I had to face a difficult truth. Perhaps I had been so busy balancing the ledgers of other people's lives that I had failed to see the growing deficit in my own son's soul. Perhaps in my own quiet, reserved way I had taught him that value was something that could be quantified, measured in dollars and cents rather than in character and integrity. The guilt was a quiet, familiar ache, but I had not put the poison in his hand. I had not signed his name on that insurance policy. I could not save my son from the man he had chosen to become. My relationship with him, the one I had cherished and mourned for years, was gone. I had to accept that. But what I could do, what I did do, was prevent him from spiraling further into a darkness from which there was no return. My actions had not been to protect just myself. They were to protect him from becoming a murderer. In a strange, sad way, it was the last act of a father. I had not saved the man, but perhaps I had saved what was left of his soul. The sun began to set, painting the walls of my living room in hues of orange and gold. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel empty. Felt still. Felt like my own. My life was no longer defined by the ghost of my son's expectations or the weight of his betrayals. It was a clean slate and open ledger. I walked over to my old wooden desk, the one I had used for 40 years. I opened the top drawer and took out a new checkbook, one tied to my personal accounts, the money I had set aside for my own retirement, separate from the trust. The funds were modest compared to the fortune I had just given away, but they were more than enough. They were mine. I opened the checkbook. The clean, empty lines of the first check looked like a promise. For so long, money had been a tool for my son, a weapon for my family. It had been a source of strife, greed, and ultimately a motive for murder. But it was just that, a tool, and a tool could be used to build as well as to break. My hand was steady as I picked up a pen. I didn't write a check to a large faceless charity. I thought for a moment and then I wrote out the name of a small local community college. I made the check out for an amount that would fund a full scholarship for one student. Someone who wanted to study accounting, someone who wanted to learn the language of numbers. In the memo line, I wrote in the name of integrity. I signed my name Jacob Peterson. The signature was firm, clear. It was the signature of a man who knew his own worth. A worth that had nothing to do with the balance in his bank account. As I tore the check from the book, I realized I wasn't mourning a lost fortune or a broken family. I was investing in a future where order and honesty still mattered. I had learned that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about balancing the books in a way that creates a better world, however small the entry may be. And in the quiet of my home, as twilight settled outside, I understood that my story was not an ending. It was a new beginning, a new ledger with a new purpose. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly peacefully solvent. This story teaches us that true strength is rarely loud. It is the quiet, calculated resolve of a person who has been underestimated. It shows that wisdom, when paired with patience, is a more powerful weapon than greed. The greatest justice is not found in fiery revenge, but in the calm, deliberate act of restoring order and protecting one's own dignity. We learn that even after the deepest betrayal, it is possible to find a new purpose, transforming pain into a force for good. It's a profound reminder that a person's true worth is measured by their integrity, not their inheritance. What did you think of Jacob's ultimate plan? Let us know in the comments below.